The kindest person in every room is usually the last person anyone protects. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern Machiavelli mapped out 500 years before therapists started calling it boundary issues. He called it being unarmed good intentions with no power behind them. And an unarmed prophet, he wrote, is always destroyed. Tonight we're going to arm your kindness. Not kill it, arm it. Because there's a difference between being good and being defenseless. And almost nobody teaches you where that line is. Before we start, do one thing for me. Comment the word unarmed below if you've ever felt like your kindness was being used as a weakness instead of a strength. I want to see how many of you are sitting with this exact feeling right now, because I think it's more of you than you'd guess. Now let's unlock the 8 signs. The first thing you need to understand is that Machiavelli spent his entire political life watching rulers rise and fall, and the pattern he found was almost always the same. The rulers who survived weren't always the cruelest, and they weren't always the kindest either. The ones who survived were the ones who had something behind their goodness. Power, leverage, consequence. The ones who fell were the ones whose goodness was the only thing they had to offer. He called this being unarmed, and he wrote it plainly. All armed prophets have conquered, and unarmed ones have been destroyed. Think about what that actually looks like in your life, not in a palace 500 years ago. A coworker takes credit for your idea in a meeting. You feel the sting in your chest, the injustice of it, but you don't say anything. You tell yourself it's not worth the conflict, that you'll let your work speak for itself. Next quarter, it happens again and again. Not because your work stopped speaking, because somewhere along the way, that coworker learned something important about you there is no cost to taking from you. You absorbed it the first time, so you absorbed it every time after. That's not an accident of character. That's a system they built quietly, transaction by transaction, and you supplied every brick. Or picture the family member who only calls when they need something. You always answer. You always help, even when it costs you sleep, money, peace of mind. You tell yourself this is what family means. But somewhere inside, you already know the truth. If you stopped answering, stopped giving, the calls would stop just as fast as the need did. The relationship isn't built on love holding both ends. It's built on your availability holding one end and their need holding the other. Here's the mechanism underneath both of those stories, and it's worth sitting with because it explains almost every version of this pattern you'll ever encounter. Kindness without any attached cost doesn't read to other people as virtue. It reads as an absence of consequence. Human beings, whether they mean to or not, are constantly testing the edges of what they can get away with in every relationship they're in. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's almost unconscious, a kind of social reflex left over from millions of years of figuring out who in the tribe would push back and who wouldn't. But conscious or not, the test happens. And if the test comes back clean every single time, meaning nothing happens when they take a little more, the taking doesn't stay the same size. It grows. Not because they're evil, because you never showed them where the edge was. This is exactly what Machiavelli meant by being unarmed. It's not that you're weak, it's that your goodness has no teeth behind it, so nobody has any reason to treat it as a boundary instead of an open door. So what do you actually do with this? 3 things, and none of them require you to stop being a kind person. First, notice the very first small test, because it's always small. It's the first time someone asks for a little more than is fair, and you feel that tiny flinch of resentment before you say yes anyway. That flinch is data. It's the moment the edge is being drawn, and whatever you do in that moment teaches the other person where it actually sits. Second, attach an actual cost to the taking, even a small one. This doesn't mean punishing people or being cold. It means the difference between silently absorbing the coworker taking credit again and calmly saying in the next meeting, "Actually, I want to walk through how I built that, since I put the research together." You haven't attacked anyone. You've simply made taking from you slightly more expensive than it was a moment ago. Third stop, over-explaining your boundaries. Every sentence of justification you add is a crack the other person can pry open and argue with. I can't help this weekend is armed. I can't help this weekend because I have so much going on and I feel bad, but I really is unarmed. Because now there's a debate to be had. And debates are exactly where unarmed kindness gets picked apart. This is only the first lesson, and it's the quiet one, the foundation the rest of tonight is built on. Because once you understand what it means to be unarmed, you start seeing it everywhere. In how people negotiate with you, in who apologizes first, in whose time gets treated as flexible, and whose doesn't. And once you start seeing it, you cannot unsee it. Which brings us to the next question, the one that actually determines who stays loyal to you and who was only ever loyal to what you could give them. There's a question most people never think to ask about the relationships in their life, and it's this: is this person loyal to me? Or are they loyal to what I provide them? Machiavelli built an entire chapter of political philosophy around this exact distinction because he watched rulers make the same fatal mistake over and over. They assumed that because someone smiled at them, helped them, seemed to love them, that the loyalty was real and would hold under pressure. It almost never did. Think about a friendship where you're always the one reaching out. You plan the get-togethers, you remember the birthdays, you show up when they're going through something hard, staying late, checking in the next day, doing the emotional labor nobody sees. And when your life gets hard, when you're the one who needs someone to show up, there's a strange silence. Not cruelty usually, just absence. Because the friendship was never actually built on two people holding each other up. It was built on you holding and them receiving. And the moment the direction had to reverse, there was nothing there to reverse. Or think about an employee who tells their manager constantly how much they love working there, how loyal they are, how they'd never leave. Then a better offer comes along, 10% more money, and they're gone within the week, no hesitation. The manager feels betrayed, but nothing was betrayed. The loyalty was never to the manager, it was to the paycheck, and the paycheck simply moved. Machiavelli's line on this is blunt, and once you understand it, impossible to forget. Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. People believe what's convenient for them to believe, especially about the people who are useful to them. And the uncomfortable truth underneath his observation is this: most loyalty you encounter in life isn't loyalty to you as a person. It's loyalty to a need being met. The moment the need changes or gets met somewhere else more cheaply, the loyalty moves with it. And it was never really about you at all. This isn't a reason to become paranoid or to stop trusting anyone. It's a reason to test loyalty honestly instead of assuming it. Here's how. First, watch what happens the one time you actually need something instead of giving it. Not a huge crisis, just a normal-sized ask. The people whose loyalty is real show up slightly inconvenienced and don't make you feel guilty for asking. The people whose loyalty was conditional get suddenly busy or vague, or make you feel like the imposition is yours to apologize for. Second, pay attention to how someone talks about people who are no longer useful to them. If a friend speaks with contempt about an ex-partner, an old boss, a former friend who isn't worth the energy anymore, the moment that person stopped providing something, take note. That's not gossip. That's a preview of what happens to you the day you stop providing something too. Third stop, mistaking enthusiasm for loyalty. Enthusiasm is loud and easy to fake. Loyalty is quiet and only visible under pressure. Judge people by what they do when there's nothing in it for them, not by what they say when there's everything in it for them. Once you start testing loyalty instead of assuming it, you'll notice something uncomfortable. Some of the people closest to you have never actually been tested at all, which means you don't know yet whether what you have is real. That uncertainty is exactly where the next lesson picks up, because it turns out there's a specific reputation you can build without meaning to that makes this whole problem worse. There's a reputation that seems harmless on the surface, but is actually one of the most dangerous things you can be known for. And Machiavelli warned rulers about it, specifically being known as endlessly, predictably, unconditionally good. It sounds like a compliment. It isn't. Because predictability of any kind, including moral predictability, is a variable other people can plan around. If everyone in your office knows you'll say yes to extra work, no matter how much is already on your plate, you're not being valued for your generosity. You're being treated as a solved problem, a resource whose behavior never needs negotiating because it never changes. Picture the person at work who everyone describes as such a team player. They cover the shifts nobody wants. They take the project nobody else will touch. For a while, it feels good being needed, being the reliable one. But look closer at what's actually happening. The work isn't being distributed based on fairness anymore. It's being distributed based on who won't push back. And once that becomes the unspoken rule, it rarely reverses on its own, because nobody in the system has any incentive to change something that's working perfectly for everyone except you. Or picture the parent who has trained their entire family, without meaning to, that they will always be the one to fix things, forgive things, absorb things. The kids grow up assuming mom or dad's patience is simply a fact of nature, like gravity, rather than a choice being made and remade every single day at real cost. Nobody in that house thinks of themselves as taking advantage. They've simply never been shown that the patience has a bottom. Machiavelli's warning about this runs through his writing on generosity, and it's sharper than people expect. He observed that a ruler who becomes known above all for boundless generosity eventually has to keep proving it to maintain the reputation, spending more and more to sustain an image until the treasury runs dry, and the very people who praised the generosity turn on the ruler the moment it stops, or turn on someone else the ruler now has to tax to keep the generosity going. In other words, a reputation for unlimited goodness isn't a stable asset. It's a debt that compounds, and eventually someone has to pay the interest, and it's usually you. So here's what to actually do about it in practical terms. First, deliberately let people see you say no, sometimes even to small things, even when saying yes would cost you nothing. This isn't about becoming difficult. It's about breaking the pattern recognition that says your yes is guaranteed, because guaranteed yeses are the thing that gets exploited. Second, make your generosity visible instead of invisible. If you stayed late to help someone, don't quietly absorb it and move on like it cost you nothing. A simple, "Happy to help, that one took me until 9 last night," does something important. It puts a real price tag on what you gave, so it registers as a gift instead of a background service. Third, rotate who you say yes to deliberately, so no single person or group can build their whole plan around your availability. Predictability is what gets weaponized. Unpredictability, used carefully and not cruelly, protects you. The uncomfortable part of this lesson is that fixing it will feel at first like you're becoming less kind. You're not. You're becoming less exploitable, which is a completely different thing, and one that Machiavelli understood better than almost anyone who's written about power since. Which brings us to the concept that ties all of this together, the one people misquote constantly and understand least. There's a piece of advice inside The Prince that has been twisted into justification for outright cruelty for 5 centuries, and it's not what people think it is. Machiavelli wrote that a leader must learn from 2 animals, the fox and the lion. The lion cannot recognize traps. The fox cannot defend itself against wolves. A leader who is only a lion, all strength and no cunning, walks straight into snares laid by people smarter than them. A leader who is only a fox, all cunning and no strength, gets torn apart the moment real force is brought against them. You need both, not because you're planning to hurt anyone, because a kindness with no cunning behind it can't even see the traps being laid for it. and a kindness with no strength behind it can't hold its ground once the trap is seen. Think about someone you know who is remarkably kind, but seems to walk into the same kind of bad situation over and over. New relationship, same red flags, same ending. New job, same type of boss who takes advantage, same burnout. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. It's rarely bad luck. It's usually a lion, with no fox, all the goodwill and strength of character in the world, and none of the pattern recognition needed to see the trap being built 3 steps before it closes. Now think of the opposite type. Someone who's brilliant at reading people, always 3 moves ahead, always sees exactly what's happening beneath the surface, but who folds the second there's any actual confrontation, any real pressure. They see the trap perfectly and still get eaten. Because seeing clearly isn't the same as being able to hold ground. The kindness you're trying to protect tonight needs to become both animals at once. The fox in you notices the pattern the second time it happens, not the 5th. The fox in you asks quietly, why does this person only need me when it's inconvenient for me specifically? The lion in you is what actually says the sentence out loud once the pattern is confirmed, and doesn't flinch when the other person is surprised that you noticed. Here's how you build both. First, build your fox by keeping a mental or literal record of patterns, instead of judging each incident in isolation. 1 late-night favor is a friend in need. 5 late-night favors, all one-directional, all slightly inconvenient, all going unacknowledged, is a pattern, and patterns are what the fox exists to catch. Second, build your lion by rehearsing the uncomfortable sentence before you need it. Decide in a calm moment exactly what you'll say the next time the pattern repeats. I've noticed I'm usually the one reaching out, so I'm going to step back a bit and see what happens. Rehearsed steadiness is what separates a boundary that holds from one that collapses the second there's pushback. Third, resist the urge to pick one animal permanently. People who decide, I'm just a trusting person, and stop there, become permanent lions with no fox. People who become so guarded and analytical that they never actually act on what they see become permanent foxes with no lion. Both are still, in Machiavelli's terms, unarmed. The goal isn't to pick a side, it's to carry both and know which one a given moment calls for. Once you start carrying both the fox and the lion, something interesting happens to how other people perceive you, and that perception turns out to matter almost as much as reality does, which is exactly where we're headed next. Machiavelli wrote something that sounds almost cynical out of context, but is actually one of the most useful pieces of psychological insight in the entire book. Everyone sees what you appear to be, but few actually experience what you really are, and those few rarely dare to challenge the perception held by the many. Read that again slowly, because it explains an entire category of things that get weaponized against kind people specifically. If you have a reputation for being soft, agreeable, endlessly patient, that reputation precedes you into every room, every negotiation, every conflict. Whether or not it's still true, people who've never actually tested you will still treat you according to the story that's already circulating about you. And the frustrating part is, you can change your actual behavior overnight, and the perception will lag behind for months, because perception, once set, is lazy. It's easier for people to keep believing the story than to update it. Think about the person who spent years being the pushover in their friend group, and then finally starts setting boundaries, saying no, protecting their time. What happens isn't instant respect. What happens often is confusion and pushback, because the group's whole operating model was built on the old version of them. That's not like you isn't a compliment in that moment. It's the perception fighting to stay intact against new evidence. Or think about someone at work who's finally promoted into a role requiring authority after years of being seen as the helpful, easygoing colleague. Suddenly they have to give direction, hold people accountable, and half the team subtly resists. Not because the new authority is unearned, but because the old story, they're so nice they'd never push back, is still running in everyone's head, and doesn't want to be rewritten. This is why simply becoming more boundaried on the inside isn't enough. You have to actively manage the outside perception too. And that's not manipulation, it's just accuracy. Here's how to do it without becoming someone you're not. First, let your actions update the story before you try to explain the story. Don't announce, "I'm not going to be a pushover anymore." Just be slightly less available the next 3 times consistently, and let people update their own model of you based on evidence instead of a declaration they can argue with. Second, control what you reveal about your reactions in the moment. If something upsets you, you don't have to broadcast it immediately or hide it completely. A calm, delayed response. "Let me think about that and get back to you," gives you room to decide your real reaction instead of performing whatever reaction people expect from the old version of you. Third, understand that some people will never update the story no matter what you do because the old story was convenient for them. That's not a failure on your part. That's information about exactly how much of that relationship was ever about you versus about the role you were playing in it. Managing your own perception is powerful, but it only protects you from the patterns you can see coming. The next lesson is about what happens when you can't see it coming at all, and why some people get blindsided by betrayal, while others somehow never seem surprised. Some people seem to have a sixth sense for exactly when a relationship, a job, or a deal is about to turn on them. They leave just before the layoffs. They distance themselves just before the friend group implodes. It looks like luck or intuition. Machiavelli would call it something else entirely. The difference between fortuna and virtù, between what chance hands you and what your own preparation lets you do with it. He wrote that fortune is the arbiter of about half of our actions, but leaves the other half, or thereabouts, to be governed by us. Half, not all, and not none. This matters because it means the people who never seem to get blindsided aren't lucky. They've simply spent so much time preparing, watching, keeping their own resources and options intact, that when fortune inevitably turns, as it always eventually does, they already had ground to stand on. Think about the difference between 2 people who both lose their job unexpectedly. One has been quietly maintaining relationships outside their workplace, kept some savings aside, kept a skill or 2 sharp on the side. The layoff hurts, but it doesn't devastate. The other poured every ounce of loyalty, energy, and identity into that one job and that one relationship with their employer, assuming the goodwill would be permanent. For them, the same layoff isn't just a setback, it's a collapse. Because there was no fortress underneath the kindness they'd been giving away for years. Or think about the difference between 2 people whose romantic partner turns out to be unfaithful. One has maintained their own friendships, their own sense of identity, their own financial independence throughout the relationship. The betrayal is painful, genuinely painful, but survivable. Because their whole self wasn't staked on one person's loyalty. The other had slowly let every friendship fade, every independent interest disappear, every financial decision merge into the partner's decisions. For them, the betrayal isn't just heartbreak, it's the sudden discovery that there was no separate self left standing underneath it. This is virtù in Machiavelli's sense, not virtue in the moral sense, but capability, preparedness, the readiness to act well when fortune inevitably shifts. Kindness without virtù is kindness with no fallback plan, and that's precisely the version of kindness that gets devastated instead of merely disappointed when someone takes advantage of it. So here's how you build virtù into your own kindness practically. First, never let any single relationship, job, or person become the entire container for your identity, no matter how good it feels right now. Keep at least one thread, a friendship, a skill, a source of income that exists independent of the person or situation you're being generous toward. Second, treat your own reserves, financial, emotional, social, as sacred, not as an emergency fund you're constantly tempted to spend on other people's emergencies. Machiavelli's rulers who survived kept their own treasuries defended, even while being generous. Generosity from a full reserve is sustainable. Generosity from an empty one is fragile and eventually resentful. Third run, occasional quiet thought experiments. If this person left tomorrow, if this job ended tomorrow, what would actually be left of me? If the honest answer is not much, that's not a reason for panic. It's a signal to start rebuilding virtù before fortune forces the question on you without warning. Preparation protects you from being blindsided. But there's a specific version of kindness that doesn't need a surprise betrayal to hurt you. It slowly bleeds you out, even when nothing dramatic ever happens at all. And that's exactly the trap we're opening next. Not every way kindness gets weaponized against you involves a villain. Sometimes it's just math, and Machiavelli's writing on generosity is really a warning about math disguised as a warning about character. He observed that a ruler who wants to maintain a reputation for boundless generosity cannot simply be generous once. The reputation demands to be fed continuously more lavish gifts, more visible sacrifice, until eventually the ruler has spent everything and has nothing left but the appearance of generosity, propped up by desperation, or worse, has to squeeze the very people being generous to in order to keep affording the show. This shows up in ordinary life constantly, and it rarely announces itself as a problem until it's already a crisis. Think of the person who becomes known early in a friend group as the one who always picks up the check, always remembers the elaborate gift, always goes the extra mile. It felt good the first few times, an expression of genuine care. But the expectation calcifies. Now it's not a kindness anymore. It's the baseline, and falling short of the baseline, even once, even during a month when money is genuinely tight, gets read by everyone else as a personal failing rather than a reasonable adjustment. Or think of the parent who has given so much financially and emotionally to one child for so long that the giving is now simply assumed, expected, unremarkable, while the other children quietly resent both the favored sibling and the parent for a dynamic nobody ever agreed to out loud. The generosity that was meant to express love ends up, over years, generating exactly the opposite entitlement in the receiver and quiet resentment simmering everywhere else. The uncomfortable truth is that generosity without a limit doesn't train people to appreciate you more. It trains them to expect more. Because expectation always rises to meet whatever the last ceiling was, and rarely falls back down on its own once it's been set. Here's how to give generously without letting the math turn against you. First, decide consciously on the actual size of your generosity in advance, rather than letting it be reactive and unlimited. This isn't cold. It's the difference between a gift and a bottomless account other people learn to draw from without asking. Second, make the limit visible occasionally, not as a threat, but as information. I'd love to help with this one, but I'm stretched thin this month. Tells people the well has a bottom, which, paradoxically, makes what you do give feel more valuable, not less. Third, watch for the specific moment when gratitude quietly turns into expectation, when "thank you so much" becomes "where is it?" without anyone consciously deciding to make that shift. That moment is your signal to recalibrate immediately, not after resentment has already built up on both sides. Managing the size of your generosity protects the relationship from collapsing under its own weight. But there's one more layer underneath all of this, the hardest one, the one people misunderstand most badly, and it's time to finally deal with it directly. Here is the line from Machiavelli that gets quoted constantly and understood correctly almost never. It is much safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. People hear that and imagine something monstrous, intimidation, cruelty, control. That is not what it means, and treating it that way misses the actual insight completely. What Machiavelli was really describing is the difference between being liked and being taken seriously. Love, in his political sense, is fragile because it depends entirely on the other person's continued goodwill, and goodwill evaporates the instant it becomes inconvenient. Fear, in his sense, doesn't mean terror. It means the other person understands clearly that there is a real consequence attached to crossing you. So the relationship stays respectful even when affection wavers. A boundary with no consequence attached to it isn't really a boundary. It's a suggestion, and suggestions get ignored the moment someone wants something badly enough. Think about the friend who has said gently for years, "Please don't cancel on me last minute, it really hurts." And it keeps happening anyway because the sentence has never once had a consequence attached to it. Compare that to the friend who, after the fourth cancellation, simply stops making plans with that person for a while without announcing a punishment. Without a dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, real cost. The first friend is loved, maybe, but not taken seriously. The second friend just became someone whose boundaries have actual weight. And paradoxically, that's usually the relationship that survives and improves, because the other person finally has a real reason to change. Or think about the parent who has warned a teenager about curfew for a year with nothing but words attached to the warning. Compare that to the parent whose warning comes with an actual, calmly enforced consequence the very first time it's crossed. It's not that the second parent loves the child less. It's that the second parent's love has teeth. And teeth are what make a boundary real instead of theoretical. This is the final piece of arming your kindness, and it's the one people resist the most because it feels at first like becoming someone harder or colder than you want to be. It isn't. It's the difference between kindness that gets respected and kindness that gets quietly, slowly consumed. Here's how to build this without becoming cruel. First, attach a real, proportionate consequence to your most important boundaries, decided calmly in advance, not improvised in anger in the moment it's crossed. The calm ones are always more credible than the furious ones. Second, follow through the very first time, even when it's small, even when part of you wants to give one more chance. The first time you enforce it is the moment the boundary becomes real instead of theoretical, and it's far easier to enforce early than after years of being ignored. Third, never confuse consequence with cruelty. The goal was never to punish anyone. The goal was only ever to make sure your kindness has enough weight behind it that people treat it as the gift it actually is, instead of a resource with no price tag at all. Once your kindness has all of this behind it, the fox, the lion, the managed perception, the preparation, the honest limits, and the real consequence, there's one final piece that holds the entire structure together, and it's the one thing you cannot borrow from anyone else. Machiavelli made a distinction in his writing that mattered more to him than almost anything else: the difference between strength that is truly your own and strength that is borrowed from someone else, whether that's an ally's army, a patron's favor, or simply the temporary goodwill of people around you. Borrowed strength, he warned, is treacherous because it depends entirely on the willingness of someone else to keep lending it. And that willingness can be withdrawn the instant it stops being convenient for them. Translate that into your own life, and the point becomes almost painfully clear. If your sense of safety depends entirely on other people continuing to be kind back to you, continuing to notice your effort, continuing to reciprocate, you are standing on borrowed ground, no matter how solid it feels today. Real security, the kind that can't be weaponized against you, comes from resources that are entirely your own skills, your own friendships that don't depend on any one person, your own sense of worth that isn't waiting for someone else's approval to feel real. Think about the difference between someone whose confidence depends on being constantly praised and reassured by the people around them, and someone whose confidence is built from things they know to be true about themselves, regardless of who's in the room. The first person is easy to control because withholding the praise becomes a lever anyone can pull. The second person is far harder to manipulate, not because they're colder, but because there's simply no lever available to pull. This is the final quiet truth underneath everything you've learned tonight. Arming your kindness was never about becoming less generous, less warm, or less open to the people who deserve it. It was about making sure that generosity comes from a fortress that's entirely your own, one nobody else holds the keys to, so that no matter who tests it, who takes advantage, who disappears the moment the giving stops, you're never actually undefended. You give because you choose to, not because you don't know how to stop. And that difference is the entire distance between being unarmed and being someone whose kindness finally, fully belongs to them. So here's the real question. Out of everything you just heard, which of these 8 lessons hit closest to home for you? The unarmed prophet? The test of real loyalty? The danger of being known as endlessly good? The fox and the lion? The perception others hold of you? Fortune and preparation? The true cost of generosity? Or finally being taken seriously instead of just being loved? Comment the number below, 1 through 8, and tell us which pattern you recognized in your own life. I read every single one. If tonight's video helped you see your own kindness a little differently, do one thing before you go. Subscribe, because there's a lot more of this kind of thinking waiting for you, and it might just change how you move through the world. Machiavelli never asked anyone to stop being good. He asked them to stop being defenseless while they did it. So stay strategic, stay guarded, and stay kind, because kindness that can protect itself is the only kind that lasts.